Chapter 22, Section 2. It's called The Enlightenment in Europe. And so we're talking about, the effects of a lot of these discoveries and how this revolution in intellectual activity really did change many Europeans' views on government and society as a whole. So start by talking about the scientific revolution in kind of retrospect. So the discoveries of Francis Bacon and Copernicus and Rousseau and Galileo, they did trickle down into the general society. And they caused many people to question things, like we discussed yesterday with religion, but also just question things that we once thought were accepted truth. And that culture of questioning led many Europeans to seek new ideas. And that's why we call this era of history the Age of the Enlightenment. That is a cultural popular movement that was going on, stressing reason and thought. Socrates once said, the unquestioned life is not worth living. And then for many years hence, everyone considered him as the major authority. Don't question Socrates because he knows everything. And that's actually the opposite of what he was trying to tell people to do. Talk about an important book today, and it's called Leviathan. And Leviathan, written by Thomas Hobbes, you guys have actually already read a quote from it, is a book about social contract, about how if we have no form of government, if there is no rules, then we live in chaos. And it's unsafe if the natural state of man, if you remember the quote, is violence. That Jonathan's going to shank me for my lunch money. Why? Because it's easier than coming up with his own lunch money. So that's the natural state of man, is chaos. And so, in order to make a safe and prosperous world, we willingly give up some of our freedoms in order to maintain a safe and prosperous society. So we give up the freedom of stabbing one another so that we can safely walk to the cafeteria with our lunch money. And Thomas Hobbes actually was not full-blown democracy, because he believed that the way to do this was to give power to a monarch, that is a ruler who maintains semi-absolute power over their people.
John Locke had several other theories and ideas that have had huge impacts across the world, even well after he died. Three we've already discussed are his blank slate, or tabula rasa theory, his description of inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, and his insistence on the separation of the powers of government. It's important to keep in mind that not many of Locke's ideas are particularly original, but they gained the most popularity due to the Enlightenment. Locke was a prolific philosopher, writing well over a dozen long works in his lifetime, some of which were published after his death. In the last video, I briefly mentioned his two treatises of government, which was published anonymously in 1689. This is one of his most famous essays, and it's as long as several books, and he talks about a whole bunch of different topics that have a great deal of relevance today. We're going to look at just one of these today, called social contract theory. Since Socrates and the ancient Greeks, philosophers have been talking about the idea of a social contract, but the Enlightenment and John Locke changed the way that we view it today. First of all, what is the social contract theory? Socrates defined it as an agreement between people of a society to abide by laws and accept punishments. Basically, if you live in a society, you agree to follow the rules. But why should people join a society in the first place? Why wouldn't they live on their own? Philosopher Thomas Hobbes believed humans were evil in their natural state, and that society, government, and laws existed because humans needed them for protection. This concept was called the state of nature, and Hobbes believed it was the worst possible outcome imaginable. Locke, however, completely disagreed. He proposed that humans are inherently good and, because we are all born equal, that the elimination of government would lead to liberty and equality, where everyone's inalienable rights would be guaranteed by each other. Locke realized that some people might take more than their fair share, and it's because people want to guarantee the protection of their inalienable rights that they form governments or a social contract. All of these members sacrifice a little liberty to follow laws, but gain protection of their rights. Through his explanation of the social contract, Locke promotes the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the belief that government is created by the members of social contracts, and that its power comes directly from them. Not only does the power come from the people, but they should also have some say in the way their society is run. Locke says that popular sovereignty is the only way to fairly govern any social contract. Because the ultimate power comes from the people and not God, sorry Carl, any society where the people can't make decisions about how to protect their own rights could form a new government, but what happens then is in the next video. Okay, time for some discussion questions. Number 1. Can the divine right of kings exist in the same society that recognizes popular sovereignty? Number 2. How much liberty should people give up to the social contract in exchange for protection of their inalienable rights? Number 3. Whose version of the state of nature do you agree with, Hobbes or Locke? Why?
Okay, so let's talk a little about John Locke. So you just saw some of that in the video. So John Locke believed, yes, in the social contract that Thomas Hobbes was talking about, but he also believed that it is the people who give the government the right to have power over them. And that also people have the right to replace that government if they're terrible. And if they're holding forcefully over them, then the people have the right to replace that government forcefully if necessary. So philosopher John Locke came up with what he called universal truths in his famous book, The Declaration of the Rights of Man. And that we have these universal rights just by virtue of being born. His basic rights, and you're going to recognize these, are life, liberty, and the next one's confusing. He called it property. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration changed it to the pursuit of happiness. But again, according to Locke, you have a basic human right to live, a basic human right to be free, a basic human right to call things that are yours, yours. And if a government violates those basic rights, they're worthless and they need to go away. Now, Locke, Rene Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Thomas Hobbes, and all these many people are authors. They're writers. We have their books. Many of them I've got on the shelf if you want to borrow them. They're also called philosophes. Philosophes. And many of these folks are living in France, and they're attending these salons, and they're having these debates. And I guess you would call them influencers, because they wrote many books that had a profound degree of influence on their society. And many of the values they stressed in these books are reason. You know, why did John Locke believe that we have these basic human rights? Because he believed they made sense. Nature. You know, our inherent nature, the very way that things work. Happiness, progress, liberty. You know, the idea that the Philosophes were proposing was, how can we build a society that makes as many of the people in that society prosperous, happy, and free? And so the next person I want to talk about is Voltaire. He was also an influential philosopher, and he wrote satire. Satire is political comedy. Mark Twain wrote satire. John Oliver does satire. Trevor Noah does satire. These are comedians that focus on politics. Jon Stewart does satire. And many of the books that he published argue for tolerance. Now, particularly, he talked about religious tolerance. He said, look, this idea of the Catholic Church telling us all what to believe and burning people if we don't agree with them, that's ridiculous. You have to understand, you have to live in a world where people are going to believe different things than you, and you have to be accepting of that. Well, guess what? He made lots of enemies, many of whom were affiliated with the Catholic Church at the time. In fact, he was put in prison twice just for expressing these views. Another of the important philosophers that I want to talk to you about is Montesquieu. Montesquieu was another French writer. He was particularly in admiration of the British system of government. You see, by the time of Montesquieu, the British had developed a government where there was a parliament, there was a monarchy, and there were courts. And he believed that these three branches of government each need to be able to tell the other branch no from time to time. That each branch needs to be a check on the powers of each other. In fact, the best illustration I can give you is paper, rock, scissors. Is rock all powerful? No. Rock is not all powerful. It's very powerful. It can beat scissors, but it can't beat paper. Is paper all powerful? No. It can beat rock, but it can't beat scissors. Each is a check on the other. Is the president all powerful? No. He gets all the attention, but he doesn't have all the power because Congress can fire him. Congress can also tell him no. And the courts can tell both of them no. But the president picks the court. You see what I'm saying? But also Congress has to confirm the court appointments. Now, each branch is a check on the other's power. And that's Montesquieu. Next is Rousseau. Rousseau was a philosopher who favored individual freedom, direct democracy. He believed in the tabula rasa. It's a fancy way of saying blank slate. He believed that each of us are born as empty vessels and that we're filled with either good things or bad things, but that we are purely a product of our environment. And so if you raise a baby and teach them all the good things, the baby's going to turn out good. If you raise a baby and you teach them all the bad things, the baby's going to turn out bad. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that, but using that logic, Rousseau believed, like the others, that government is a social contract, that we have to believe in the decency of humanity, and that a social contract is an agreement by a free people choosing to form a government.
What is the purpose of government? Imagine a time before kings, presidents, or prime ministers, before the formation of society and civilization. This is what philosophers call a state of nature. In this thought experiment, people lived freely, without rules or formal laws. But what exactly does this state look like? For 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature is a war of all against all. Mankind's basic nature is fear, insecurity, death, and turmoil. And from this constant terror, people decided to surrender some basic rights to a sovereign entity, or what he called the Leviathan. If one was, say, fed up with the theft of his potions, the state could pass laws to protect his goods or help him receive some sort of reparation. This protection is important for a number of reasons, but the most significant is that laws and their enforcement keep constant anxiety at bay. For 18th century Swiss-born French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the state of nature is rather different than that conceived by Hobbes. Rousseau sees natural man as independent, solitary, and peaceful. Rousseau thought people were much better off without government. With the creation of agriculture, private property, and the division of labor, however, came inequalities. Unequal access to resources created tension, enmity, and envy. People started to become aware of their limited material situation and lack of upward mobility. They became aware of their unfreedom. This led Rousseau to claim that man is born free and is everywhere in chains. While both philosophers describe the state of nature as a sort of beastly existence absent any morality, they disagree on some fundamentals. Rousseau sees the Hobbesian model as leading to despotism, in which people have no choice but to turn to a third party to secure basic needs. Consequently, they do not freely choose their leaders. Rousseau argues that rather than choosing leaders out of fear, people choose to give up some power and rights, at least so that citizens can be equal. Rousseau dictated that decisions ought to be made for the sake of everyone, instead of a few. This would require that people follow a rule of law that they would follow on their own anyway. For Rousseau, people are better without government, because society means unfreedom and oppression. Whether out of fear or for the sake of equality, the consent to be ruled is called the social contract. So, listeners, I ask, who has it right? Do people need to be kept in line, or should they remain free to do as they wish?
Okay, so the Philosophes really did advocate reason here. And the next person I want to talk about is the Italian philosopher Cesare Beccaria. Cesare Beccaria, who worked to reform the criminal justice system. He wanted to fix the way that trials were conducted. And if you read another really interesting writer from a little later, but Alexander Dumas wrote the book Count of Monte Cristo, and it followed the story of young Edmond Dantès during a time in which France was ruled by a king. He was arrested for a crime he did not commit, and he was held for 20 years without trial in a French prison until later he escaped, and he spent the rest of his life getting revenge on people. It's an amazing story, but it also tells a very sad picture of the criminal justice system in France. You see, he was arrested for a crime he did not commit. He was never allowed to tell his side of the story, and he was locked away in prison for 20 years. Well, Beccaria wanted to fix this. For one, having speedy trials that were public, in which defendants got to tell their side of the story, and that story was heard by a jury of their peers. So, next, views on women. Many Enlightenment thinkers, like the painting that we looked at the beginning of class, felt that even though equality is something that we all need to strive for, women needed to maintain their traditional roles. But there were also female philosophers like Mary Wollstonecraft who argued that women were on an equal footing socially to men. And she argued that women need access to quality education, and that women should have just as much rights to go into any profession that a man might choose to. For example, politics. Why can't a female make and pass laws? Why can't a female hear cases? Why can't a female govern? And so Wollstonecraft was a prolific writer and leader in this movement for women's equality and women's rights, but many other women were involved in engagement. So the role of the Philosophes. Voltaire was no warrior. John Locke did not lead armies. Montesquieu did not rally people in the streets of Paris. They're writers. They're not activists. They absolutely believed in progress, and they advocated for a more secular outlook to improve their society, and they certainly criticized many previously accepted notions. But it would be up to others to But the Philosophes stressed the importance of the individual. You know, John Locke's idea that we all have basic human individual rights. That means that every one of you, regardless of where you're from and what government you previously were a part of, you have the right to live. You have the right to be free. And as Thomas Jefferson would later interpret it, you have the right to live your life in the way that you choose, as long as it does not infringe on those basic rights of someone else. And so, among the Philosophes, reason became the central concept in these discussions.